Hello, it's Aaron Wren. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, my guest is Josh Abbotoy, who is a managing director at New Founding and also a principal in two interesting real estate developments I want to talk to you about today. One called Ridge Runner USA, which is doing a development in Burkesville, Kentucky, and another one focused on the Highland Rim in Tennessee. And I can promise we're going to do a lot more than just promote real estate projects here. But I thought these were interesting because they really tap into some of the trends that we're seeing in our society today. So wanted to get a sense from Josh about how he's trying to tap into that, what he's seeing in the market. So Josh, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Aaron. It's good to be here.
Can you give us a very, very brief 2-minute discussion of your projects, and then we'll flesh that out a little bit as we talk through them a little bit more?
Yeah. So the first one that we're down the development road is this development through Ridge Runner in southern Kentucky. We have about 700 acres, really pristine in a couple locations. One is in the hills and valleys of what's called the Highland Rim Escarpment in northern Cumberland County. This is near Lake Cumberland in southern Kentucky. The other one is right on the banks of the Cumberland River. And in this part of the world, the Cumberland River is a really clean, fast-flowing river, excellent trout fishing. Both of these locations are very off the radar, at least as of today, really pristine locations, wonderful places to sort of live and spend time, very low crime, very attractive farms. Parts of the countryside here look like like Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, but just very beautiful, bucolic countryside. And so we've made both of these available, and we're really intentionally marketing them to remote workers. And we can get into some of that, but with the widely available high-speed internet that's out there right now, including in very rural areas, it opens up a whole new way to live and work for a lot of people who are ready for a change of scenery and want to be out in a more pristine natural setting. So that's the Kentucky project. And then really briefly down in Tennessee, we have not even announced a location yet. We put out a very preliminary announcement, got a lot of positive and the little negative feedback on it. But we are doing a project in the same general region that's over the border down in Tennessee. And more to come on that, but folks can just check that out. But it's very early days. We're just making our first purchases on that next project.
Yeah. As many of you may know, I've done a lot of work in public policy. In fact, that was really what I was focused on prior to pivoting into the kind of work I do now. And I'll still kind of keep my toes in the water. Last year, I did a study on the future of Appalachia for the Urban Reform Institute. And really what we're seeing is parts of Southern Appalachia really starting to take off. It's some of the last physically beautiful land in America that has, kind of doesn't have climate extremes and is reasonably priced. If you go out to the Mountain West, even places like Idaho and Montana that would have been, considered utter backwaters that you would have to be a lunatic to move to not that long ago, are now sky-high prices. You can't afford to get out there. And so people are now turning to the mountains in the east, into the Appalachian region. That's happening just organically through the market, particularly as remote work has started to enable people to not be tied to a particular local labor market. But there are other factors that are really animating some of what you are doing there, some of it related to what's been called the big sort. Can you talk about that?
Sure. The big sort is a thesis that's been around for a while, probably 20 years now. Demographers started to notice that there was a politicized character to the way that people were moving around in the country. And, it's all the things that you would guess, right? But conservatives have been leaving California for 20 years now, and there's people movement in the other direction as well. I think generally speaking, many of the states in the union have been getting more politically polarized, like they're getting more solidly blue or red in many cases, and that's just a result of people moving. Of course, 2020 poured gasoline on that trend. Reportedly approximately 6 million people have moved since 2020 and 20 million still want to. So, as much transformation as we've seen in the market, studies and indications would appear to studies would appear to indicate that there is much more movement yet to happen. Where people choose to go, obviously, the top line, factor seems to be the political alignment of a particular state that shows up in polling data when people tell Pew, for example, why they move and where they move. Political and cultural factors are now in the top 6 reasons, whereas in the past they haven't really showed up in these studies. So we're starting to see some evidence of that in the studies, and then there's a very bifurcated choice or draw factor for these people. So in recent years, conservatives have moved strongly towards preferring rural areas and small towns. So it's actually 66% of conservatives now, when they move, they're seeking to relocate to a rural or small town area. The political breakdown is exactly flipped in the case of Democrats. Democrats now strongly prefer urban areas when they're moving, and this is a new trend. I mean, that 20 years ago there might have been a marginal difference between Republicans and Democrats on where they chose to live, but this wide gulf has really opened up over the last 10 years, especially, and I think especially coming out of COVID.
Yeah, it used to be, I think the line was this: California, people are leaving California because it's so expensive, because it's so crazy, and the California refugees are going to turn your state blue. And the model here was Colorado, where that really did happen, where a bunch of people moving into Colorado flipped its political alignment. Maybe something similar happened a bit in Nevada. But what we've seen recent years is something that's different. We're seeing red states getting redder. So a state like Idaho that was already solid red, the people moving in are more heavily Republican than the existing mix of the population. In my understanding, I don't have good, hard polling data on this, but everything I observe is that the people who are moving in are actually harder core than the existing residents who are there. In a place like Indiana, it's typically been animated by a sort of folk libertarian ethos, get off my lawn conservatism, but not really particularly ideological beyond that. Whereas, people coming in from California are like, wait, we got to head off the craziness at the pass before it gets here. It's really sort of shifting the politics in places like Montana, Idaho, and even Texas is seeing something of the same phenomenon there. So there really is this sort of, I think, political migration. Now, Tennessee and Kentucky are both solid red states. No real prospect of those flipping to the other side there. Obviously, Tennessee has become quite a destination nationally. Kentucky less so. How much of this do you think is that what you're seeing, what you're tapping into, is related to this desire to create sort of birds of a feather type communities? And, I think of, for example, Moscow, Idaho, obviously with Doug Wilson there. Lots of people have visited Moscow, Idaho, and come away thinking, wow, we need to create this near where I live. Here's a town near me that could use some TLC. We could come in there, attract a bunch of people, revive the town, etc. There's also some Catholic examples like St. Mary's, Kansas. And interestingly, it's just an article in the Atlantic, I think, about all the tech guys who want to create their own cities. I think the idea is it's the kind of the charter cities movement and some of the old seasteading and these people who are trying to build a city in somewhere about outside of the Bay Area where they bought up all this land. The idea being that sort of the existing forms of governance, the existing forms of community are failing. And we need to go retreat, maybe even retreat is a word a little bit, into a place where we can create a community that's aligned with how we want to live. And this is not entirely, I think, conservative. I think intentional communities on the left have always been a big thing. But I think there's kind of an aspect of that I'm seeing out there. Is that something that, you're thinking people would want to move to these places to be part of not just to be in a red state, But are you trying to create a particularized kind of community there?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you're spot on that you could call it, you have to call it something. So I'll call it an affinity based community. Um, these are popping up across the map. One that I've studied a fair bit is Serenbe. It's a pretty high end residential development outside of Atlanta, Georgia, which is constructed from the ground up, new construction, but made to look like a small town, sort of an aspirational rural lifestyle. But it's also a bit crunchy. It's for it's for people who want to be 40 minutes outside of Atlanta, and so it caters to wine and yoga moms and that sort of thing. Um,
I
and
assume
and
it's
I
a
think
wealthy community.
it is. Yes, it is. And stepping back, I guess here's what I would say. I think that for quite a while, the facts of where must I work, and then maybe secondarily where do I send my kids to school, dominated the choice about where you lived. And this resulted in what you see outside of major cities, which is relatively homogenous at income level neighborhoods. So in Dallas or Houston, the cities I know well, there's very like granular gradations of neighborhoods. There's the accountants neighborhood, and then there's the petroleum engineers neighborhood, and so on. I mean, but that dominated, I think, but with the rise of remote work, I think that people are starting to. It's just opening up room for people to actually conceive of what do I want out of my neighborhood? Like what do I really want when I go out my front door? And then the twin. I think the factor that sort of is coming alongside of this remote work factor is the increased political division in the country, which does actually get down to some very basic things about like how should we raise our kids, what books should be in the library, that sort of thing. People, I think, generally speaking, are tired of fighting the culture wars when they go out their front door, and that's on both sides. And the nature of the divisions does just get down to very practical questions about how you're going to run your community. And so I think we're seeing increased demand in many different quarters to have more values-based alignment, because people want more of a integrated life where they see their neighbors socially, and they have a social life with their neighbors. But that's only possible when there's some degree of confidence that you share some basic values and you're not going to be fighting over these culture war flare-up issues.
Yeah, I've definitely seen these sorts of called them master plan towns, like New Albany, Ohio, or the Woodlands outside of Houston
Mm-hmm.
would be something like that. They weren't political, but they were definitely trying to create a particularized kind of community around a vibe or a lifestyle that they wanted to have. Um, the Moscow thing is really intriguing to me. I did a little newsletter post about this not long ago. Was I call it the N=1 problem? It's like everybody goes there and thinks it's amazing, but nobody's really replicated it, and it really wasn't something that was planned from the top down. So
Mm-hmm.
I say, wow, here's the formula, here's the model, but they really didn't. It was sort of an organic development over many years. How do you feel about the ability to catalyze something like that with some degree of intentionality?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got to have the basic material conditions that make a place good to live. Jobs, schools, in our case, a lot of natural beauty, and I think an organic connection to an authentic American regional culture that can be stewarded and then elevated and marketed. I mean, um, this is perhaps another component, but people increasingly want to feel like they're from somewhere. Most of the major cities in the country are, relatively interchangeable once you actually just get down on street level. And so people like the distinctiveness. If you go to parts of Appalachia, you're in a particular region, and people have an accent that they've had for 200 years. And certain things, certainly part of the way of life has modernized, but part of it is still very old fashioned in some ways, and that's actually really attractive to a lot of people. So I wouldn't say we're trying to replicate Moscow. They have several things going, but if you look at them analytically, a lot of what, of course, they've got the church there, and everybody knows they've got a church with a nationally prominent pastor. They've also got a college, and the college needs faculty, and it brings out students. And then there were businesses, like tech businesses, that were started up by members of that community, gave jobs to members of that community, were bought and sold, and there's new startups coming out. And so, it happened organically, but when it really took off, you had material conditions that made it possible to have a community like that. So, I would say that, yes, the real estate projects that we are doing are designed to be particularly appealing to conservative Christians. And I think that's generally who, not entirely, but generally speaking, that those are the sorts who are going to, seek us out. But, maybe in contrast to a place like Moscow or elsewhere, we're attending to those material conditions as part of our development efforts. And then, frankly, with respect to culture, that's an organic thing that takes time. And, there will be an extent of decentralization in our strategy. We will try to encourage pastors, encourage other people who want to launch schools and things like that to come be involved in the project. But that's not something that you just, create with an edict from on high. Like, that has to arise organically from groups of people, getting together and getting excited about planting a church or, founding a school or that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, what I'd say is there's so many people looking to relocate right now. And a lot of them are essentially pulling out a map and dropping a finger on a random place. A lot of the people relocating do not have family in these areas that they're moving to. They don't even have other, there's not necessarily even other things on the ground. And so they're really just picking rural areas largely at random right now. And so, I think the opportunity is to plant a little bit of a flag and get some marketing out there and awareness to say, essentially, here are some places where other like-minded people are gathering as well, and building a community together.
Yeah, my experience with small town life is that if you're not from there, it can be very difficult to get connected. You're always going to kind of be something of a stranger. And so having a critical mass of kind of outsiders there that they can kind of befriend each other while they integrate into the community is, I think, a good idea. The same thing's true in urban areas. You go into a place like Indianapolis, a lot of the people who hang out with each other downtown are all the people who aren't from there, but they got a job there. They moved there because, the people who moved there already have established friendships, established social lives. That's one of the virtues of a place like Dallas or New York, that the transience of it has its downsides, but also makes it a lot easier to get connected, get plugged in. Whereas the more rooted it is, the harder it is. So jump starting the idea that there's like more than one person moving to this place, it is, can be important in a sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a collective action problem is how I'd put it. Nobody wants to, it's kind of like in the cities when rough neighborhoods are gentrified. Now these places are not rough, but it's a little bit analogous in the sense that usually happens by communities. I mean, in the cities, it's often gays, LGBT community that gentrify tougher neighborhoods, right? And then go in kind of en masse, or at least in somewhat critical mass, and then flip what were otherwise sort of distressed properties and make it like a cool neighborhood. And then, of course, after then come along all the more bourgeois people. Similarly, I mean, in this case, what I would say is, if you're a white collar conservative Christian worker in Silicon Valley, you want to get out to the country somewhere, but you're not exactly sure where. You are thinking hard about and especially if you go visit these places, you're thinking hard about, how am I going to find other people like me? What's the transition going to be like, going from, a place that's full of other tech workers and people who share a lot of, maybe some at least vocabulary and income bracket, going from that to going to a much more rural place. So, I mean, we see a couple things. One, there's, as I said, towards the front end, there's 20 million people who want to move. So it's not like, moving out to Appalachia is not for all of that 20 million, but you only need a small percentage of that number to want to move to actually materially change Appalachia, because, Appalachia is, not a big region, and certainly a very under-resourced region relative to some of these wealthier areas. But, the other thing is, once you get, critical mass, you get people with more of a pioneering mindset to go out and do it. People do psychologically love this idea that they're finding a diamond in the rough, that they're, that there's just something, a lot more people have that sort of pioneering mentality that can be activated if you just show them a little bit, give them the on-ramp, give them a little bit, and then they'll start to imagine, themselves there and having a future in that community. It's tricky, it's what we're doing is I'm not aware of any other companies doing it right now. And so we're constantly, testing how we do things and how we market, and even how we, what we market, right? Like, what do we buy? There's no playbook for it. But the only thing I would say is we know the demand is there. And so, we're testing a lot of different ways of going about it right now.
Yeah. What my experience, people who move to a place that's not one of the usual suspects, they tend to become the biggest evangelist for the place. For example, when I lived in Providence, if you chose to live in Providence instead of Boston or New York, then you're probably someone who's out championing the virtues of Providence. Like, why did I come here? You kind of feel the need to justify your decision a little bit. So you're always like aggressively marketing, I think, a lot of the places. Got a couple of comments here I want to share. From this guy, Forge and Anvil. He said, Middle Tennessee has a sense of cultural Christianity that makes for a solid foundation there. And then the other thing he had to say was about small towns. People in small towns have low outer walls but high inner walls typically. And so I think that's accurate, meaning, they're very, very friendly, and, they'll kind of invite you in at one level very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
but getting to the inner circle is a little harder. That may be a little bit of mine. You mentioned some of the press that you got. It was really interesting to me to contrast the press over these Silicon Valley initiatives, which by any measure are backed with vastly more money, are vastly more radical in their intents and other things. And they're often viewed as kind of quirky or quixotic, perhaps, but they're sort of tweeted with a little bit of legitimacy. Whereas, you had a major publication write an absolute hit job on you, which seemed ridiculous when all you're trying to do is, attract some people to Tennessee and Kentucky. What's going on there? Why do people hate this so much?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So the Guardian ran a nasty hit piece on us, and a couple other outlets ran adjacent stories. I think that I think the left doesn't really have a paradigm for understanding conservatives who want to build culturally productive communities, aspirational communities. They don't. It's like, for conservatives to come up with sort of creative and outside of the box, development solutions is just they don't have a category for it other than some very tired old tropes that have been around for 30 or 40 years. Whereas when a techno utopian, comes out with some idea, it is treated with a lot more legitimacy because it's not sort of inherently right wing. And so, I think that's part of it. And look, frankly, these things are, especially for something like what we're doing, it's hard to talk about. It's the kind of thing that's best shown rather than told, right? And so that there's, like when you're at the front end and you're trying to describe, what we're going to do, what do I really want? I envision neighborhoods that embrace traditional American aesthetics, that honor the culture of where we do our development. So rather than terraforming Appalachia with colonies of sort of homogenized just general American corporate culture, find ways to draw out, honor, elevate Appalachian classic architecture, art, all the rest, and try to do it in a way that doesn't destroy and disrupt that way of life. There will be change, but hopefully it's change that's got an organic continuity to the region's history and traditions. And that's what we want, and that's what the people moving out want. They like the cultural Christianity, they like the old country churches, they like the agrarian aesthetic and lifestyle. And so, yeah, I mean, we need to find a way to preserve this. We've got a lot of naysayers, and I think that it's probably, again, I don't think that the mainstream has a paradigm to put this in yet. And so, leftist journalists, these kind of silly people, for clicks, they'll write a hit job about something really scary or what have you. But I think in time they'll see what it's about, and maybe the attacks maybe they'll stop, maybe they won't. I don't know, but I wanted to tell some of the journalists who came after us, you really should have written this story like a year from now or 2 years from now, and we'd really give you something to talk about, because right now it's just a pretty modest little maybe $2-5 million investments. It's tiny. And like, I guess I'll say finally, I wish, I mean, journalists are just so bad now compared to how they used to be. I mean, they used to take down presidents and everything, and now that they barely cover it. It's left up to sort of fringe right-wing publications to cover Bill Gates and other private equity funds or foreign investors buying up farmland all over America, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Guardian isn't going to touch that, but they'll turn around and come focus on some very modest little project that me and my friends are doing. So it's strange, but I'll say, you've probably experienced some of this as well, but our target market, they could not care less what left-wing publications think, in fact, or even mainstream ones. I mean, in fact, the fact that we were attacked by mainstream publications endeared us to our target market. It drove sales originations and all the rest. So, that's just where we're at right now. And so in some ways, I don't totally begrudge the negative press, because it's actually been, good for business in some ways.
Yeah, I always say you should try to have a positive agenda, not just always be opposing other people's agenda. And here you are trying to build something nice in areas that actually need the investment, in areas that are already very politically red, and you're still getting attacked. So I guess there's really, that's just the reality of how it's going to be. Again, I thought this was a really interesting play that you had, trying to create these sort of affinity communities in these areas, because again, in what I've called the negative world, in this kind of uncertain political climate, this sort of time of polarization, this time of these sort of big sorts, people are moving around a lot. And I do think people are looking for new models and new ways of, how should we live? How should we be trying to create community together? You don't use this language, and it's probably not a perfect example, but it is almost something. An affinity group community is almost something like a Benedict option community, to put it in sort of Rod Dreher speak. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of this. And again, it's new to the market, so we'll learn some things from your experience as to maybe what sells and what doesn't. But I think it's really interesting what you're doing.
Well, thanks. And I to follow up on that point, more fundamentally, even than some of the politics, I think is what's really driving a lot of the best people to do this move is a desire to have more agency in their lives. And that's a general statement, but what do I mean specifically by that? Um, a lot of people my generation, like if you're a conservative Christian and you've made a lot of trade-offs in your professional life, to live in the city, to work for a big corporation, um, what you've done is you've actually traded off some agency, and maybe that's a good trade-off, but you've granted some agency to, you live in a city where you don't own a lot of land, so you don't really control your environs. You work for a large organization that will make demands on what you say and how you act publicly. So you've ceded sovereignty, and now sometimes that trade-off is worth it if you're part of a city that you believe in or a big corporation that you believe in. That can be worth doing. But there's been a cataclysmic drop in confidence among conservative Christians that the trade-off is worth it. I think we all know that, the fallout from Brandon Ike at Mozilla, and we could go down the list of other similar examples. Those stories told conservative Christians very clearly that if you want to work at a big corporation, the price is your silence. You cannot be a cultural leader. If you can't speak to some of the most pressing issues of the day if you want a job at Goldman Sachs or the leading law firm or whatever. And and people have, some people get comfortable with that trade-off, but especially with the ascendancy of DEI and the sort of the collapse that in confidence that you will be rewarded on a meritocratic basis for being a productive employee, that's dropped a lot, and then of course cities locking down during COVID, having spikes in crime and all the rest have really reiterated for people that local government matters a lot. And I don't, if you live in Dallas or Manhattan, as a conservative Christian, you don't have a realistic shot to getting close to civic leadership. On the flip side, if you live in a small town, you and your friends can get politically engaged and have a seat at the table. It's already going to be more amenable to your values, but then you actually have a realistic path to true civic and cultural leadership there. And if you own land, you immediately, by owning land, you have some own space. It's psychologically, it gets you into a different place. And I'm just seeing a lot of people. I'm personally an example of this, and I'm seeing a lot of people of my generation who are starting to hear this siren call. And so I think really at root, that's what it is. It's people that are dreaming about a better future and wanting to arrange the material conditions in their lives so that they can be in a position where they've got higher agency.
Well, that's great. I definitely think people feel a loss of control maybe in this era, and we'd certainly like to have more of that. Well, Josh, thank you very much for joining me. And again, I'm going to put links in the show notes to both of these developments, the Ridge Runner USA link, and then the project to be specified in more detail later in the Highland Rim in Tennessee. So you can check out more about that if you're interested. Josh, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Aaron.